Right here we have the Sony a6100 as well as the Sony a6600. Now, these cameras look almost exactly alike and have the same video recording specs, but this one costs over $450 more than this one. So in this video, I'm going to cover the differences between these two cameras to help you determine whether spending the extra money on this one is worth it for your videos. Hey everyone, Camber here, showing you how to use your camera to make good videos. And today we're looking at the Sony a6100 that costs $750, as well as the a6600 that bounces around between $1,200 and $1,400 depending on what kind of sale is going on. So let's take a look at some of the similar features of these cameras as well as the differences to help you understand why this camera costs more than this one. So with both of these cameras, you get an APS-C size sensor that gives you 4K up to 24 frames per second with no crop. And the reason I bring that up is because similarly priced cameras like the Canon M50 will give you 4K at 24 frames per second, but it crops in 1.7 times on the sensor. And so when you're shooting with something like a 50mm lens, it's now like using an 85, which can be very limiting depending on how much space you have in your video. So with these, you don't have any crop factor aside from the normal 1.5 from the APS-C size sensor. And you also get full HD up to 60 frames per second with each of these cameras with no crop, so your slow motion will play back 2.5 times as slow. And you also have the option of 120 frames per second in full HD. However, there is a slight 1.1 crop in on the image in that mode, and you'll get an even smoother looking slow motion playing back 5 times slower. And the other great thing you get with both these cameras is unlimited video recording time. I bring that up because Canon cameras, once again, have a 30-minute video recording limit, so the camera automatically stops recording at 30 minutes. I have another video explaining this I'll post down below and up in a card somewhere for you, but this is basically some old tax laws that drove this, and Sony is finally getting rid of this in all of their new cameras. Panasonic, a lot of other brands are starting to, but Canon will not get rid of this limit, so it's really nice if you're doing long-form recordings like a wedding or a long YouTube video, podcast, all that type of stuff. You can just hit record, know that it's going to keep recording because it is a pain. I've done it many times, forgot to push record again, and the video stopped and I'm talking for 20 minutes and realized nothing was recorded. And the other great thing that both of these cameras have is touch autofocus and tracking. So with that touch autofocus, you could touch something on the screen, the camera focuses on it for you. You touch something else, it'll rack focus to that really well. And this is super helpful for you instead of sitting there with manual, trying to focus, get it just right. Or if you have someone else helping you, like my wife has helped me with lots of videos, can tell them, hey, push this, and when I go over here, push that, and it works really well. As well as the touch tracking. Let's say, for example, you have something that's going to be moving closer or further away from the camera. You can touch that object and it'll track that as it comes closer and further, which is super helpful with instead of manual focusing. Like I've done weddings before, I'm trying to manually focus on the bride as she's walking down the aisle, and it can be quite difficult depending on the speed, and you touch them and it tracks them all the way instead of jumping from face to face. It's super helpful there. And also the autofocus works great in all modes, 4K, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second. And I bring that up as well because once again, Canon cameras, when they crop in on the sensor, that 1.7, they're using a much smaller portion of the sensor. So all those pixels that we're using autofocus in full HD no longer do a good job in 4K. But these cameras, autofocus great every mode. So those are all the important specs that you'll get with each of these cameras, but why does the 6600 cost so much more than the 6100? Well, I'm going to go down the list now, starting with the most important stuff to me, and the first thing is picture profiles that you'll get with this camera. Now, if you're not familiar with picture profiles, it's basically a setting on your camera that records a more, you could say, washed out image with less saturation, less sharpness, so that you can add all that stuff back in later. Because essentially when you don't have those, everything you're recording gets baked in the image, and it's a lot harder to change that stuff in post without the image falling apart. Whereas with picture profiles, you can add in the amount you want and you have a lot more room for editing to make the stuff look how you want. And if you're just starting out and don't know how to do all the post-processing work, you can use the regular profiles, and as you learn more about color grading, color correction, you have that option to get even more out of your camera with better dynamic range, things like S-Log. And the other great thing about that is that you can match this camera with more expensive cameras like the Sony a7C or a7S III or even cinema camera, so it becomes a really powerful B camera if you want to use it for that. And the next thing you get out of this sensor is 5-axis image stabilization, which is always a great option because that's going to give you even smoother handheld footage. And next up is the handle on the a6600 is quite a bit larger than the a6100 because you have a much larger battery, which is the same battery that you get in the A7 series cameras, which is really helpful when you're using the same type of cameras together because you can swap out batteries. But you can see the difference here, a6100 battery, a6600 battery. So you get a lot longer battery life on the camera, which is always a good thing, especially when you're recording live events, so you're not having to change batteries constantly on these cameras. And next up on the a6600 are custom modes on the dial. You can see I'm on video mode there, but there's also a 1 and 2 custom mode. So that makes it so you can pre-program different custom modes onto this and switch to that quickly. For example, I leave 4K 24 frames per second in my normal video recording mode. And then in number 1, I'll put 60 frames per second with the shutter speed already set at full HD. And then number 2, I'll put 120 frames per second with the shutter speed set at 250 to have that good 180-degree rule. So if I'm shooting something live, I want to go shoot some slow motion, I can click over really quick. Everything's already set for me. I just need to change the white balance if necessary, and then click back and get my normal 4K 24 frames per second video. You do have the option of programming that into some memory modes here, but you have to scroll through some settings, whereas this, you can just easily pop it back and forth and you're good to go. The a6600 also has more programmable buttons on the back and the top for custom modes. So things like white balance, spot metering, autofocus modes, all those type of things that you use more often. You have more buttons you can customize that to on the camera on the a6600 over the 6100. However, there are function menus on both, so you can still quickly access whatever settings that you need that you use most often on the a6100. And although both cameras give you great autofocus in all modes, the a6600 incorporates eye autofocus tracking as well. So instead of just having a box over the face like the a6100 does, this a6600 goes even further and will show a little box over the eyes when it detects it, so you know that it's really focusing in right on the eyes instead of just somewhere on the person's face. Next up, the a6600 has a weather sealed body, whereas the a6100 doesn't. That doesn't mean I'd go out in a downpour of rain and be filming stuff, but if it does start sprinkling or something, you know that you're probably more protected with the a6600. And finally, the last thing that you get from the a6600 over the a6100 is the addition of a headphone jack in the side. There's one extra slot down here that the a6100 doesn't have. However, I rarely wear headphones and monitor the audio when I'm recording, so it depends on how important that is to you, but you do have that option available with the a6600. So with all that, I would personally go with the a6600 over the a6100 because I like to get the best quality possible out of my camera, which in this case isn't video quality, but all the added features that make the functionality of the camera even better, because I don't like having to upgrade in the future, which I've ended up doing a lot of times because I end up realizing I want those extra features the more I use the camera. However, if it came down to getting the a6100 and using the extra money that I saved for a better lens as compared to the a6600 with getting a cheaper lens, then I would definitely go with the cheaper camera and the more expensive lens, because the lens you use will have a greater effect on the quality of your video than the camera will in most cases. And if you want suggestions on lenses, I have another video that I'll link below and up in one of the cards that'll show you the best lens that I recommend regardless of camera, regardless of brand, because all brands have this lens. But if you have any questions about either of these cameras, feel free to leave them down in the comments. I'll try to clarify anything I can and help you out there. But if this video is helpful, then please hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and watch more videos, because I have a lot of videos and playlists on the channel that'll teach you how to get the most out of these cameras with all kinds of cinematic filming techniques and great stuff that will help you become a better filmmaker. And speaking of that, I also have a private Facebook group, also linked in the description, that you can join, and I can better answer your filmmaking questions. So with that, I hope to see you soon.